Alrighty, well, I might get the show on the road. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining today. Just quickly introduce myself. So, my name's Trent Hawkins, and I'm a principal consultant at Northmore Gordon. I've been working in the sustainability industry since 2009. I was originally at Beyond Zero Emissions and led some of the sector decarbonisation plans that they produced. And more recently, have been a principal consultant at Northmore Gordon since 2016, supporting industrial and large commercial businesses in energy and carbon strategy development, energy management systems, energy auditing, and government policy advice. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners whose land I'm presenting on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Yeah, so today's Net Zero webinar is brought to you by Northmore Gordon. We're a leading energy and carbon consultancy with offices in Australia. So we've got an office in Melbourne, Sydney and Newcastle, and also in Singapore. We help large business in industry and the built environment reduce costs, energy costs, and decarbonise while becoming more sustainable enterprises. And Northmore Gordon has been focusing on industrial energy systems ever since we began over 10 years ago. We have the strategic and technical experience to assist business in every step of the emissions reduction journey, from developing high-level corporate strategies, preparing carbon footprints, identifying and implementing emissions reduction projects, such as renewable energy, energy efficiency, fuel switching, through to creating and trading carbon offset certificates. Yeah, so obviously in the lead up to the COP26 World Leaders Summit on climate change, which is going to be held in Glasgow in November, there's a seeming multitude of discussions about net zero emissions, decarbonisation, carbon offsetting, and a number of other things. And in 2021, it seems like every week a major multinational corporation is making bold announcements, committing to emissions reduction targets and implementing net zero emission strategies. But what does it all mean? It can be confusing to decode all the words and frameworks and schemes available for emissions reduction, and to differentiate between things like science-based targets, net zero emissions, and carbon neutrality. Well, today, Northmore Gordon is hosting this webinar to help decode some of those buzzwords, explain the different certification schemes that exist out there, and also to provide some practical sector-specific advice for how you can actually reduce your emissions. And just before we get underway, we're going to hear from a couple of, both from Chris Suarez and Claire Key, who will be presenting on the topic. But before we get into that, so if you have any questions during the presentation, we'd like you to do is, as we're going through it, just to drop them in the chat box or at the end of the presentations. And then we'll have a reasonable amount of time at the end of the presentations to talk through the questions that are there. So I'll just be reading through what comes up in the chat box and selecting some questions for the presenters. So in the meantime, just have your thoughts going on what your questions can be. Okay, so look, pleasure today to introduce two speakers. So we've got Chris Suarez, who's a principal consultant based in our Newcastle office. And Chris has over 20 years of experience on a range of energy and carbon management projects, including energy audits of manufacturing facilities, commercial office buildings, hospitals and aged care facilities, energy simulation modelling of commercial buildings for Building Code Australia, and also NABERS energy assessments, and also net zero emissions roadmaps and a range of other services. And Chris has prepared greenhouse gas inventories for several clients under the New South Wales Government's Carbon Leadership Module, and more recently been involved in preparing net zero emissions roadmaps for Coppers Australia, Kosciuszko Thredbo Resort, and Baiada Enterprises, amongst other large energy using businesses. And next up, the first speaker will be Claire Key, and she's a senior consultant based in our Sydney office. And Claire joined Northmore Gordon in 2019 with experience developing and delivering energy performance contracts at some of Australia's most iconic buildings, including museums and art galleries, sporting facilities and universities. And since then, Claire has delivered energy and carbon management activities that cover baseline development, benchmarking, opportunity assessments, energy action plans and strategy development across a range of facilities from farms to manufacturing facilities. So take it away, Claire, over to you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll just quickly share our presentation and we will be underway. Right, so today we'll be aiming to decode some of the buzzwords around net zero and help you with some sector-specific advice with how you could get there. In this workshop, we aim to answer the following questions. What does net zero actually mean? What does a net zero roadmap look like? How your company can start setting targets, or what is actually a good target? What your company can do now to reduce your emissions, and what are others doing? So we have some case studies ready for you, and we'll present them to you at the end. So firstly, let's address what net zero by 2050 means. I'm sure most of you have heard those terms kind of kicked around in recent months, and certainly in the lead up to, as Trent alluded to earlier, COP26, we'll see more and more of these claims or ambitions being publicized. So what it means, it is a result of the UN's peak body on climate change's research, so the IPCC's research, that concluded that in order to mitigate against the most catastrophic events of climate change, we must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what this looks like is a 50% reduction in baseline emissions by 2030 and neutralizing those emissions, or net zero, by 2050. If the focus is deep emissions cuts in the next decade in order to avoid that catastrophic climate change outcome. So why is this important? What happens if we don't act? This chart maps out different global temperature scenarios under the following assumptions. So at the top, you have a 4 degrees warming scenario where no climate policies are set, or even there's no ambition to set any climate policies. And that means that emissions will continue to be intimately linked to economic growth. So pretty much business as usual. There is a middle of the road scenario, a greater than 2 degrees scenario, which most connect with how current policies are set. And that means that emissions will continue to hover around current levels by mid-century, so till about 2050, before they start to decline. And we won't reach net zero by the year 2100. This would result in an uncontrolled transition. There could be vulnerability to social instability and resource scarcity as well. The optimistic scenarios, the 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees pathways, are the pathways that the IPCC has told us would best align or best keep our current modern way of living as much as possible. And the 1.5 degrees scenario is actually the IPCC's most optimistic scenario, which describes a world where global carbon emissions are cut to net zero around 2050. And this is a scenario in which the severe impacts of climate change are avoided and modern living is decarbonized by mid-century. So as you can see, the 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees pathways show that urgent and rapid reductions in emissions are required to maintain our current modern way of living. The longer we delay a peak in emissions, the more drastic the reductions would need to be later on, which would mean a more disorderly transition. So what does this mean for the private sector? Put simply, climate change is a disruptor. It's happening. The longer you wait to act, the more uncontrolled the transition. And as we've learned from the digital disruptors of the last decade, fast movers and leaders will be rewarded, whilst laggards will be facing a chaotic and, as mentioned, an uncontrolled transition. For the private sector, or even customer-facing businesses, or public-facing businesses, there are both risks and opportunities. So, in terms of a physical risk, yes, climate change results in physical risks such as natural disasters, or such as bushfires or flooding. This could impact any facilities or assets if they're in such locations. Natural disasters can also impact your supply chains. From a resource perspective, will your raw materials be affected by drought? Frequent natural disasters makes planning close to impossible. I'm sure most of you would have felt the effects of COVID or that sort of extreme, chaotic events. And yes, if we anticipate this coming, we can manage that risk, or manage our risk to, best respond to those events. In terms of transition risk, have you considered the legislative risk to your business? How exposed are you to those changes in legislation in regards to climate change? In Australia, at least, there is no commitment yet at the national level, but our two most populous states, New South Wales and Victoria, have very clear ambitions. Victoria is committed to a 45 to 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, and even in the last week, New South Wales has bumped up its ambition from a 35% reduction to a 50% reduction by 2030, and both have committed to net zero by 2050. And in terms of foreign kind of ambitions or legislation, if your company has an overseas parent company or you have a large export market, legislation can affect your bottom line and the way you operate. And there is also increasing scrutiny by financial bodies. A lack of, or a poor carbon strategy can impact your access to finance and even your share price if you're publicly listed. So the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, or APRA, considers climate change a financial risk. In April of this year, they have released guidance to banks, insurers, and superannuation trustees on how they can manage the financial risks in terms of borrowing and lending money in the face of climate change. So what they really want to avoid is financial institutions investing in what they view could be a stranded asset. So it's not all risk, there are opportunities as well. As you know, climate change is a disruptor. Fast movers and leaders will be rewarded. Consumer sentiment has shifted and is continuing to shift. For direct-to-consumer products, there's an opportunity to build customer loyalty and drive revenue growth by aligning your actions or your product to your stakeholder values. For B2B businesses, the demand for low carbon products will push up the supply chain, and there will be an expectation that you align your product, or that the embodied energy of the final product is a zero carbon or net zero product. And lastly, of course, a lot of direct emission reduction projects can actually result in a cost savings. A smart carbon strategy actually results in an improvement to the bottom line. And in our case studies we'll introduce a bit later, you'll see how this can be realized. So this is what a journey to net zero could look like. Largely the steps may change in order depending on your risk profile and your company's access to technology and capital, but it should largely stay the same. For most, the target setting component might happen at different points. If you have a parent company that has requirements in that nation to set strategies and targets, you might have those targets imposed to you you operating in Australia. Alternatively, some of our customers want to see all their cards in front of them or all their options in front of them before setting a target, in which case some of this target setting might happen towards the end of the piece, so that they are sure that the target they set can be achieved. Regardless of all this, establishing your baseline is always the first step. To walk us through how an emissions baseline and carbon footprint can be put together, I'll just pass it over to our other speaker, Chris Warris.
Thank you very much, Claire. Hopefully this comes across.
If you want, Chris, I'll just I can just step through mine and then you can tell me to move forward.
Yeah, all right. Thank you very much, Claire. Well, is that working now? Oh no, you're bringing yours up. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Claire. All right, so I'm just going to talk about a few key terms around establishing your emissions baseline. So starting from the left there's carbon versus carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon and carbon dioxide are often used as synonyms, although they can be used a bit differently. Similarly, the terms carbon and greenhouse gas are also synonyms. While they can mean slightly different things, they're generally used interchangeably within the context of greenhouse gas management. GHG is an abbreviation for greenhouse gas. The carbon dioxide equivalents. So there are 6 main greenhouse gases defined by the Kyoto Protocol, and each gas has a different global warming potential, which compares the warming impact of 1 unit of that gas to a unit of carbon dioxide. This enables all those gases to be compared and summed up and measured and reported in equivalent units. So the main one is obviously carbon dioxide, CO2, but there are also other important greenhouse gases as well. So the second one is methane, CH4. So it has a carbon dioxide equivalence of 28. So that means that 1 tonne of methane has the same global warming potential as 28 tonnes of carbon dioxide. And there are other gases there, nitrous oxide from combusting fossil fuels, HFCs are the refrigerants used in air conditioning and refrigeration, and PFC and SF6 are specialised industrial gases. You can look at some other terms are the greenhouse gas inventory or carbon footprint. These are also synonyms, so carbon footprint, greenhouse gas inventory is the same thing. Also, emissions baseline is the same, but typically refers to your inventory or footprint at a reference baseline year. Carbon neutrality commonly refers to a situation where the net emissions associated with a product or your activities are equal to 0, either through your own reductions or also through the acquisition of carbon offsets. Absolute emissions reductions refer to reducing or eliminating your actual on-site emissions without relying on off-site reductions to net out those remaining emissions. And the carbon offsets are what are used, the financial instrument that's used to, in which emissions reductions or removals from one activity or sector can be used to offset the emissions from another. Next slide, please, Claire. So another area of key terms is the emission scopes. So we've got a little infographic there showing the 3 emission scopes. So scope 1 are direct greenhouse gas emissions that occur from sources that are owned or controlled by your organisation. So that's the combustion of natural gas and other fuels on your site, or combustion of fuels in your company-owned vehicles. So it's emissions that are occurring directly under your control from your equipment or on your sites. The second category is scope 2, and this typically relates to electricity. So in this case, it's kind of indirect emissions because you're using the electricity, but the emissions from that electricity have occurred at the power station, which might be several hundred kilometres away. So they're not occurring on your site and they're not occurring from your equipment, but you are intimately responsible for those emissions because you have used the energy. You've transformed the energy, so those emissions need to be allocated to you. And the third category is Scope 3. So these are indirect emissions that are generated in the wider economy as a result of your activities. They typically physically occur elsewhere, and they're from sources that are not owned or controlled by your organisation. So one organisation's Scope 3 emissions are another organisation's Scope 1 emissions. Next slide, Claire. A little bit more on Scope 3 emissions. So Scope 1 and 2 emissions are considered essential to report on and to reduce. They're mandatory under the Australian NGER Act, the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act. Scope 3 is generally considered voluntary. It's considered voluntary under the International Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but various certification schemes do require some level of Scope 3 consideration. And it's worth noting that there has been some focus recently in the media on Scope 3 emissions. You may have seen recently that BHP was widely criticised for not including a Scope 3 target in its emissions reduction plan. And conversely, Fortescue was widely praised for including a Scope 3 target and plan. So it seems that more stakeholders are increasingly requiring organisations to look at their Scope 3 emissions. And I mean, it can be a useful thing to do because Scope 3 emissions provide an insight into your indirect carbon costs and the exposure of an organisation to carbon risks in its upstream and downstream supply chains. Assessing Scope 3 emissions can be quite complex. It's very easy to spend a lot of time and effort going down rabbit holes, chasing the information because you don't have operational control over the data. So it's really important to consider the materiality of your Scope 3 emissions. You don't want to spend time and effort on relatively minor Scope 3 emission sources or ones that are difficult to influence. A fairly common example is that I see a lot of organisations try to accurately quantify their employee commuting emissions. And it can, they spend a lot of effort with expansive employee surveys trying to figure out what those employees are, all the different ways they're arriving to work, and then doing programs to encourage carpooling and public transport and things like that. And while that might be, is quite laudable and noble, for most organisations, particularly manufacturers, employee commuting is likely to be a very small percentage of their emissions, and it's going to be time consuming to assess accurately, and there are much bigger things that they could do with that time. So our approach is to Scope 3 emissions is to do an initial screening of an organisation's Scope 3 emissions under each of the categories in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which were shown in that infographic there. There are your upstream and downstream categories. The initial screening can use whatever readily available data you have, such as data that you might already report or track for internal or external environmental management reporting or other financial reporting, such as annual dollar spend, things like that, or any other proxy data that can be used to estimate these emissions. So the aim of that initial Scope 3 screening is to identify which ones are the most significant and which ones can be considered immaterial, and also to identify which ones you can influence the most in your operations. So you might choose, after doing that initial screening, it might be apparent that there's 3 or 4 of those categories that are the big ones, are the main ones. So then you would implement some measures to more accurately measure and track those emissions moving forward and have some sort of plan around those ones, rather than spending lots of time coming up with data and plans for relatively minor emission sources. So on the journey to net zero, after you've established your baseline and done some stakeholder engagement, the next step is to set a target. So how does that look? So there's no There's currently no legislation, at least in Australia, that compels organisations to have a net zero target. However, there are a number of voluntary frameworks that can be used to guide your approach, or to independently certify or endorse your strategy or your results to give credibility to your claims, so you can rise above the greenwash of other organisations claiming they're doing all these great things but not really backing it up. So we've highlighted here 3 frameworks that are of increasing relevance to Australian organisations. The first one on the left there is the Climate Active program. That's an Australian government-backed program, and its main purpose is it enables you to become certified carbon neutral now. So you can certify your whole organisation, you can certify a product stream or a service, and have that independently certified and stamped by the Australian government as being credible. And that certification is very, very useful and valuable for a lot of organisations. And really in Australia, it's the only way you can get something that's properly certified. Another one is science-based targets. So this is a global initiative. This is a global initiative that's driving, asking organisations to make a pledge to commit to these science-based targets. So in the short-term targets to 2030, organisations need to commit to a 50% absolute reduction in Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and also include Scope 3 if they're significant. There's no current standard, but science-based targets are working on a net zero standard, and that's scheduled to be coming at the end of this year. That'll allow organisations to get a certification through that scheme as well. The third one there is RE100. So this is a global corporate renewable energy initiative. So this is focused on renewable electricity. So if you sign up to RE100, you get to use their logo and commit and promote your commitment, but you must match 100% of your electricity across your organisation with electricity produced from renewable sources. Next slide. Okay, so just a little bit more information on how you can use offsets and certificates to help you with these targets. Under Climate Active, as shown on the infographic there, you need to reduce your Scope 1 and 2 emissions to zero, and either by absolutely reducing them on site, but you can use the various certificates. So there's a number of acronyms in the certificate business that you can use to offset your remaining emissions. So there's ACCUs, which are the Australian carbon credit units, but then there's also international ones as well, VERs and VCSs, and there are others as well. LGCs are renewable energy certificates, so that's around renewable electricity in Australia. So you can also use them to offset some of your Scope 2 electricity emissions. And then Climate Active, you also have to include relevant Scope 3 emissions in your target, and they have specific guidance on how to approach Scope 3. Science-based targets doesn't allow offsets, so you have to physically reduce all of your on-site emissions. Except for electricity, you are allowed to use renewable electricity certificates for that part of it. And again, you have to consider Scope 3 if they are more than 40% of your total emissions, which for most manufacturing businesses, that would be the case. It'd be unusual for a manufacturer not to have a significant Scope 3 footprint, simply because of the raw materials coming in and out of the business. And then RE100 is really just focused on that, the Scope 2 electricity. So you either reduce it yourself or you offset it by purchasing renewable electricity. Note that with the certificates, if you create certificates for your emissions reduction projects, you can do that. If you have a project that reduces emissions, you can create ACCUs or LGCs for it. But if you then sell those certificates, you can't claim those emissions reductions as your own, as you've essentially sold those reductions to somebody else who will then claim them as theirs. However, you can use these certificates as revenue to finance your project, up until your target date, and then at that point, surrender them without selling them. It's also worth noting that there are the energy efficiency certificates. So you may have come across ESCIs in New South Wales and VEECs in Victoria. These are different. They don't strictly represent a carbon reduction. They're an obligation on the energy retailers to encourage energy efficiency. So these ones can be sold as revenue, and you can still claim any associated emissions reductions as yours. The certificate space can be quite complex, and we don't have much time to go into it fully today. It probably needs a webinar of its own, but we can certainly provide more info on that if you're interested. Okay, I think I hand back to you now, Claire.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. So yeah, so here we are on our journey to net zero again. We've established our baseline. We've got all our stakeholders involved. We know what target we need to hit. So now, what are the risks and opportunities around our net zero ambition? So firstly, we need to address the intention delivery gap. Have you ever said you were going to do something but somehow never got around to doing it? Or probably more relevant to our participants here, identified a great opportunity to reduce emissions and improve plant reliability, but somehow that opportunity got pushed down to the bottom of the priority list. Without a plan or structure of accountability, we're facing, yes, the intention delivery gap or the intention behavior gap. This is a space that occurs when the values or attitudes of an individual don't really match up with the actions. At Northmore Gordon, we view an effective carbon strategy or management plan to have 6 elements, which you can see right here. These the 6 elements. They address kind of the key aspects to a good carbon strategy or action plan. Firstly, addressing why you're doing this, so starting with the drivers and the context. Onto the baseline and targets. Where are you starting from and where do you want to get to? So that's what Chris just spoke to before. Next is stakeholder engagement. We haven't spoken about that too much here, but really you'd need to know who needs to be involved and what are their responsibilities and what they are, so what they're responsible for. Next, onto a robust carbon and energy performance program. How can we avoid an ad hoc approach to emissions reduction? How can you set your business up for the best success? Onto our opportunities and business cases. What opportunities are there to reduce our emissions? And lastly, to deliver, keeping in mind the importance of monitoring and verifying our results. Did everything go to plan? What can be improved next time or the next time we review this cycle? If you have a manufacturing background, some of these concepts might feel a bit familiar. An effective carbon strategy and action plan looks very similar to a continuous improvement plan, where we assess where we're starting, have a plan for how we're going to do it, and then review at the end to see if we can improve. And to help you assess the robustness of your carbon strategy, we have a free tool available on our website if you're interested in filling out. This tool helps you benchmark your your processes against best practice, or your business frameworks against best practice, and it helps you identify gaps in your carbon strategy and action plan. It addresses topics such as corporate commitment, how do you have the people or the human resources available to deliver the carbon reduction opportunities, how is financing set up so you can actually fund your projects, how engaged are your staff, and how you can better source or strategically source your energy and manage your certificates to get the least cost outcome. And now specifically onto our emissions reduction opportunities. We believe that there are 4 key or main levers to carbon reduction, which can each be pulled at opportune times to achieve your target under the least cost pathway. So on the far left, we have direct emissions reduction, which can be in the form of energy efficiency projects, equipment optimizations and upgrades. Could potentially include switching to a low emissions fuel such as biogas. Potentially you could limit production waste and reduce the amount of embodied emissions in that waste, and also to avoid the embodied emissions in that waste and eliminate the associated energy use as well. Moving on, we have on-site renewable energy, which is the energy that you generate and consume on site. So this can be in the form of, a solar PV site, a solar PV system on your site, or it can be a biogas or hydrogen plant that you, or it could be biogas or hydrogen that you produce on site and use and consume for heating. It's important to remember that maximizing the use of renewable energy on site, because we don't want to overinvest in systems that are very large, but don't result in an outcome focused on our own operations. And then moving on to some of our purchasing options. So as Chris purchasing options such as grid purchase renewables. So in order to reduce your scope 2 emissions or emissions related to grid purchase electricity, you might want to consider signing up to some sort of power purchase agreement for renewable energy through your retailer or directly through a generator. Note that LGCs need to be claimed in order to truly reduce your obligations. Electrons created at the solar farm, for example, won't know that your site is the one that they need to go to. So creating LGCs and making sure that so if the power plant creates the LGCs and is transferred to you, that is a true reflection of you, taking ownership of the renewable energy generated there. So there's a public ledger of all the LGCs created across Australia called the REC Registry, and that's managed by the Clean Energy Regulator. And lastly, on our far right is carbon offsets that can be purchased to neutralize the remaining emissions that we can't reduce with available technologies or procurement options. And as Chris alerted, so the first 2 on the left, the direct emissions reduction and on-site renewable energy, have the option of creating certificates for the projects to create revenue. But as Chris alluded to earlier, if you create ACCUs and LGCs and sell them, you are kind of giving away that emissions reduction. And so in the short term, it can help you with return on investment if you sell them. But if you stop selling them just before you hit your target, then that should help you with that emissions reduction. And you'll note that they're ordered in this manner from left to right, because on the left are direct emissions reduction, on-site renewable energy. Whilst they initially have a higher capex, they often result in a net savings per tonne of abatement, while as our purchasing options to the right, while they have low or no capex, result in a net cost per tonne of abatement. So yes, if you commit to a target and you rely on, for example, buying LGCs or buying offsets to reduce your obligations, you're essentially imposing a carbon tax, an internal carbon tax to your business, because whatever you're unable to reduce, you have to pay for that to offset those emissions or reduce your obligations from those emissions. So back onto our journey, we have explored, so we've established our baseline, got everyone on board, committed to a target. We understand the risks, our risk profile. We know about all the technology and the capital available to us. So, and then now is to deliver. And a net zero roadmap could look something like this. So we have addressed all the different options available to us, so all those projects or strategies under each of those carbon reduction levers, and yeah, painted what could look like this. So we would want to pull down or act on each of those levers at opportune times to achieve a least cost and least risk pathway. And on that note, I'll pass it back to Chris to speak on a couple of case studies that we prepared to show you how this can be done in practice. So Chris, I'll continue to navigate.
Thanks, Claire. Yes, please keep driving. All right, case study. Firstcast case study is a chemicals manufacturer. They're industrial chemical manufacturer in Australia. They have a number of sites across Australia, but one main site that is responsible for the majority of their emissions. They had a historical focus on energy management, largely driven by the cost of energy and trying to reduce those costs. But they were also reporting their Scope 1 and 2 emissions under NGES for many years. They were required to do that. And as a result of those two things, reporting and aiming to reduce their energy use, they'd actually already achieved a 23% emissions reduction over the last 10 or so years. But they are their corporate head office is in the US, and they were coming under publicly listed, and they were coming under pressure from shareholders and investors to have an emissions reduction strategy or a net zero plan. Initially, the business didn't have a clear sense of whether it was realistic for them to set significant emissions reduction targets or how any target could be achieved. They're actually a carbon-based business. Their main materials are carbon-based. And so typically, traditionally they hadn't really wanted to think about climate action and carbon reductions, but they were just starting to be forced to by investors. So with a bit of financial support from the New South Wales government, we helped them to develop an emissions reduction strategy for their Australian operations. So we helped them to develop a number of emissions reductions projects using the levers that Claire had outlined. So we looked at electricity efficiency opportunities. So lots of small or relatively small projects, things like variable speed drives, compressed air optimizations, pumping, process control optimizations, things like that. A lot of gas efficiency opportunities as well. So steam system optimizations, boiler upgrades, other furnace burner improvements, insulation and better process control. They also had a lot of heat recovery opportunities. So lots of waste heat currently going out of their various stacks. So there's an opportunity to capture some of that heat and reuse it on the sites. Then they can look at on-site solar PV. So they've got a lot of space that they can use to install solar PV. They can also generate electricity using a cogeneration system. So this would be burning gas to create electricity and heat for their process. But it's a little bit problematic. It has good potential, but it would eliminate their Scope 2 electricity emissions, but it would increase their Scope 1 emissions because it would increase their gas use. And that's much harder to offset or more expensive to offset than Scope 2. So the alternative to that would be the last one, buying renewable electricity, and that would just add an operating cost. So with all those things, it's worth noting that there's nothing particularly radical in there. There's no new technologies or unproven technologies. All of the projects use readily available, well understood and proven technologies, which doesn't mean they're necessarily easy projects. Some of them do require some engineering and integration effort, but they can all be put into a project plan right now for implementation, commencing straight away and progressing over the coming years. So plugging those projects or those opportunities into a roadmap demonstrates that they can actually achieve significant emissions reductions. So if the graph I've shown here is based on the 2007 baseline in order to try and recognise their successes to date. So they can relatively easily achieve a 50% scope 1 and 2 reduction by 2030 off that 2007 baseline with cost-effective projects. But if you use a 2018-19 baseline, they need to purchase some renewable electricity, which is the yellow bar there, to get them to 50% off that 2018-19 baseline. So that will cost them a small amount to do it. But it shows that it can be done without having to invest in anything experimental. So the business now has a tangible pathway with practical projects that can be implemented to achieve their emissions reductions. They can now confidently commit to and communicate a credible 2030 emissions reduction target, knowing that they can actually achieve it. Beyond 2030 and looking towards net zero by 2050, they're going to have to start looking at some new technologies, things like hydrogen for some of their higher temperature process heating, more electrification of their process heating, carbon capture perhaps, and other opportunities as well. But at least they've got that interim target ready to go with projects they know they can do. The strategy also looked at assessing their scope 3 emissions, which are largely from the production and use of their raw materials and sold products. So these scope 3 emissions are more than 10 times their own scope 1 and 2 emissions, so they're very significant. And it kind of just highlights their exposure to the decarbonising world. If the world really does achieve net zero by 2050, they're going to have no raw materials and no market for their products anyway. So they're now looking at diversifying their product offerings. For example, producing carbon for battery electrodes and things like that. Our second case study is from a food manufacturer with a number of sites across Australia. They're a large energy user with a total energy consumption across the organisation of over 2 million gigajoules per annum and total scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions of nearly 220,000 tonnes per annum. So quite a large energy user and greenhouse gas emitter. And again, they've been reporting under ENGIES for many years on their scope 1 and 2, but they'd never looked at scope 3 before. But they realise that they are likely to be impacted as the economy transitions to net zero emissions, given their large emissions profile. And they're already starting to feel these impacts, in particular from supply chain pressures from their major customers. So they're a food manufacturer in Australia, so their major customers are Coles and Woolworths, who have both made public net zero emissions commitments. And they've made them under those schemes that we mentioned before, climate active and science-based targets. So they're having to look at their scope 3 emissions. So Coles and Woolies are looking at their scope 3 emissions, which is all of their suppliers in Australia. So that's where this organisation was caught, getting pressured by their customers to give them data and provide them with their plans for getting to net zero. Sorry, can I just go back to the previous graph? Yeah, so they needed to prepare this strategy. But so just on the right there's a graph of their inventory, and it's worth having a look at that because it's useful to look at that inventory in a graphical form because it kind of highlights where their major emission sources are and where they can focus their effort. So for these guys, electricity was scope 2 emissions from electricity was the main emission source, 3/4 of their emissions profile. So that's one of the key it's the key focus for emissions reduction projects. But also natural gas is the next largest emission source, scope 1 emissions from natural gas. So that's the other area to focus on. Next slide. So again, we looked at those various levers that Claire mentioned, and we looked at electricity efficiency opportunities. So again, things like variable speed drives, compressed air, refrigeration optimizations and upgrades, lighting, ventilation fans, air conditioning. Gas efficiency opportunities, again, steam system upgrades, insulation, things like that, and boiler upgrades. A lot of on-site solar PV opportunities. Electricity, they're a big electricity user, so lots of roof space on their factories that they could generate their own electricity. They also have a very large biogas opportunity. They have a lot of waste that they have to treat, so they have an opportunity to create, they can actually create enough biogas from their waste to replace nearly all of their current gas use, effectively eliminating their Scope 1 emissions from natural gas. And then the last lever is to purchase renewable electricity for whatever's left. And again, note that none of these are radical or new technologies. They're all well established, readily available, proven technologies. Now, many of these opportunities had already been identified by the organisation, and some of them had been on the books for many years, but not progressed or implemented. And what they noted was that while many of the projects have reasonable paybacks, they're typically greater than 2 years for energy projects. It can be quite difficult to get energy projects with a less than 2 year payback, which means that these projects they struggle for priority against other projects within the business. So the business has projects around improved productivity or new product lines that just have a better business case. So they just never get to these energy reduction opportunities. So setting a carbon target, it will increase the priority of these projects, and hopefully, well, it should lead to more implementation, because it effectively sets that internal carbon price. If they commit to a reduction by a certain time, they either have to reduce their absolute emissions by doing these projects, or they have to pay extra money for offsets at the end. So it gives these projects an extra financial incentive and an extra priority within the business to get it done. So plugging those projects into the roadmap out to 2050, and you can see that they can get to net zero by 2050 by implementing all of those projects. They can eliminate their Scope 1 natural gas emissions by making a lot more biogas. They can do a whole bunch of electricity efficiency. They can do some on-site renewable energy, and then purchase renewable energy for the rest. And you'll note that early on, from 2025, they're going to purchase renewable electricity, and it's going to be a reasonably significant cost, but it's going to decrease over time, because as they implement more on-site renewables and more energy efficiency, the gap lowers and they have to purchase less renewable electricity. So just looking at the cost of those projects, if we're able to quantify the cost and savings of all those projects, and we can see in this graph, it's a little bit busy, but the key things to note are the red line at the top is the business as usual energy costs. So that's if they do none of those projects, their energy costs will increase over time. But if they do these projects, they can reduce their energy costs by 50%. So, we hear a lot of talk, particularly from our politicians, about net zero targets, and they want to know, how much is it going to cost? Well, I think it's the wrong question. The question should be, how much is it going to save? All right? It's going to save money for a lot of organisations to actually do this. So in this case study, their emissions reduction strategy, net zero pathway, demonstrates that net zero is achievable with readily available cost-effective measures that can start to be implemented straight away. It results in overall cost savings for the business, and they can now confidently commit to and communicate some credible 2030 and 2050 emissions reduction targets, knowing that they can actually achieve them. And that strategy can now, the strategy and the targets can now be communicated to their key stakeholders, especially their key customers, and keep them in business. So I think we've reached the end of our presentation, and at Northmore Gordon, we're very happy to help you with any aspect of your carbon strategy. Perhaps the first step might be to check out our free carbon health check on our website. The link is there, and that's just it lets you benchmark your current carbon management strategy and readiness, and helps you identify where the gaps are to focus on. Takes about 5 to 10 minutes and you get a report at the end. But also following on from that, we'd be happy to help you with any other aspect as shown in that infographic there, whether that's overall strategy development, engagement with your key stakeholders, development of a greenhouse gas emissions inventory or carbon footprint, whether that's scope 1 and 2 for ENGIEs or having a look at your scope 3 footprint. We can help you identify emissions reductions opportunities, physical or contractual, help you implement those projects, help you access the certificates to help you fund it, look at the M&V that you need to do for your projects, and then wrap it all up into developing an emissions reduction plan or net zero pathway, modelling alternative scenarios and setting some targets. So we can help you with any aspect of that. And I think we're now at the end, so we'll hand it back to Trent, who hopefully will moderate some questions.
Thanks, Chris and Claire, and yeah, really fascinating, interesting presentation. So appreciate that. And yeah, look, we may have had some early problems with the chat, so I don't know if there were questions that were asked initially, but got a couple that did come through, and so we'll just ask those, and then if anyone has further questions, please just pop in the chat, and potentially we may ask people just to raise your hand as well if you'd like to ask a question, not through chat if you weren't able to send it through the chat box itself. Yeah, look, so was one question there by looks like Sani Satinda about what cost model has been used for the capital investment. So perhaps, yeah, I wasn't sure entirely the detail on that question, but maybe just, you know, what information have we used to underpin some of the costs that's in the modelling for those case studies, Chris?
Looks like he's frozen.
Or Claire, you'd like to take that one?
Yeah, so the cost modeling, I didn't personally work on this project, but for most of them, they're based on expected energy savings and the cost of implementing, so the cost of capital to implement those projects at those specific times. Chris is back on. Maybe I'll pass it back to him.
Yeah, apologies. I just it just crashed on me, and it's let me back in now though. So looking at the first question, the cost model. Well, I mean, each project is modelled individually, depending what it is, I suppose. You know, if you're looking at a pumping system, we have some pumping models that we can use to evaluate the energy for that, energy savings. And then CapEx is either directly from actual quotes or using various costing guidelines for the types of equipment.
That's great. And the next question from Richard Keach, hello to Richard, was why is a 100-year global warming potential being used for methane? So the 28 times CO2 release for methane based on 100-year global warming potential, and noting that New York State now using a 20-year time frame. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, I know that, yeah, it has changed over the years. It used to be, the factor used to be 21. It's now been increased to 28 as more research goes into it and the modelling improves. From our perspective, I guess we just use whatever the framework requires. So, for example, in Australia, if you're a large organisation, you have to report under ENGIEs, and that has a specific factor that you have to use, and that's what you need to use under the legislation. Climate Active will defer to the similar rules as the ENGIEs. Science-based targets will have its own rules, usually set by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and those numbers are always updated. So look, we will just use whatever the factors are for the framework that you're aligning to.
Okay, and yeah, I haven't seen any further questions come through. So, you know, potentially if you'd like to just raise a hand and then you can come off mute and ask a question directly. We do actually have another half an hour of questions, so it's a chance to really explore anything specific, and you might have specific questions. You know, if you've come from an organisation yourself, you're looking at, you know, whether you should go with science-based targets, or register under the Climate Active Carbon Neutral standard, there's an opportunity to explore that directly here. While we're waiting, I had a question myself, to either Claire or Chris about, what are some of the clients that you're seeing? What are their priorities in the net zero emissions pathway, the roadmap that they can go on? What's important to them? Are they looking for carbon reduction opportunities? Are they wanting to set targets? Get an inventory? What's being the main thing you're seeing?
I might speak to a couple of my projects or my customers. A lot of them, the way that they're approaching it is they don't know where to start and they don't know how to set a target, and they prefer to set a target once they know all the cards or all the options in front of them. So what we've been doing is putting together all the opportunities that they've identified so far, helping them identify more of them, just to see what the different scenarios could look like. Because it might be that it's not, it's too capital intensive to do all the project they have on their books, or it could be too costly over a long period of time to purely rely on offsets and buying green power, for example. So we've been identifying ways where they can approach their target setting and approach their carbon strategy from more of a balanced approach, mixing both those direct emissions reductions that are readily available with current technologies, mixed in with some renewable energy purchases and purchasing offsets in order to achieve that least cost pathway. Because at the end of the day, as Chris has shown us before, the right strategy can actually result in an improvement to your bottom line. So that's kind of the approach that I've been taking with my customers and projects.
I mean, I would say that things have changed a lot in the last couple of years. I think maybe 10 years ago there was a flurry of activity in this space, and there was a few organisations that went into this net zero carbon neutrality plan. They were the early adopters. That often they were very green aligned organisations, but after that, it's been pretty quiet for many years. I think a lot of organisations are just focusing on energy reductions for the cost reductions, and they didn't really think they had to worry about carbon emissions. But in the last couple of years, we're really seeing a lot of organisations being forced to, either by their customers or investors, and now they're scrambling to come up with a credible plan and find out what to do. Of course, the other one is where we have clients with sites in Australia, but they're part of multinational organisations that are headquartered elsewhere, and the head office develops a target, says, right, here's our global emissions reduction target, and all of a sudden the site goes, oh, okay, great, how do we do that? So that's where that's the other big driver for some of this action.
That's a good point, Chris. I'm currently working with a construction company that's facing kind of that customer push. So, there's been a lot of chat in the built environment space that, net zero buildings will become an expectation, not just operationally, but embedded energy as well. So all the, products and services that go into that construction are facing or will soon face the same expectation that they need to provide a low carbon product or service to support that ambition.
Great, and we did have someone raise their hand in the attendees list. So Chloe Tame, I think it is, if you wanted to come off mute and ask your question, that'd be great.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I couldn't get the chat to work. It wouldn't let me type anything in. Interesting feedback. My question relates to the two case studies and the differences in industry that they represent. Case study 1 being the chemical manufacturer and case study 2 being the food manufacturer, and the huge difference in CapEx investment and payback terms. what sort of barriers do you see on different industries being, I suppose, better suited or more limited to investment strategies to achieve carbon neutrality or carbon reductions, given that the size of investment you're looking at in those two case studies are so vastly different, and the conversations to get those sort of projects across the line would also be vastly different?
Well, I mean, so some of the numbers that were in there are, I guess, an aggregate of a number of smaller projects. So that's the first, I guess, comment is that in some ways you can get there with lots of small scale projects, but I take the point that they are going to need some significant investment in both cases to do some big ticket projects to actually make big reductions. And as I sort of mentioned, even though they do have reasonable paybacks, it's typically not less than 2 years, typically not even less than 4 years. So typically energy projects have a payback of between 4 and 10 years. So it's still cost positive. It's still better than the cost of finance. It's still worth doing, but they just struggle to actually get round to doing it because there are other projects within the business completely unrelated to energy that take all their effort, and they can only do so many projects. And that's part of our job. We see it every day, and that's our role, is to facilitate getting those energy and carbon projects up the list. So there's plenty of capital out there for projects. It's just getting it higher up the priority list, beating out some of the other projects. And that's where setting these targets really helps, because there's a deadline that the projects need to get done by, and if they're not, then there's going to be additional costs to the business. Does that help? Does that kind of answer the question?
No, it does. Thank you for your insight.
Okay, great.
Thanks for asking the question there, Chloe. Anyone else wanted to raise a hand and ask a question if you couldn't get it in the chat? Otherwise, I think it's now working and you should be able to post something in there. I guess while that's people pondering, I mean, it's worth noting as well that both, well, particularly New South Wales and the Victorian governments, having these emissions reduction targets to actually facilitate the achievement of them are going to require some level of government support, and whether it's through some of the energy certificate schemes or direct grant funding. And I know that New South Wales has a net zero industry and innovation program with $350 million worth of funding for hard to abate sectors, which could go directly to large CapEx projects. Yeah, so just to sort of comment there, or any other, I mean, I guess that's something that we can also help with is identifying potential grant funding or even finance to access to pay for the capital for those projects. Yeah.
And there's an increasing number of, I guess, alternative finance companies or service offerings out there. So in one case now, we're working with an organization to consider the revenue from selling ACCUs, or Australian Carbon Credit Units, to support a large project that's been on their books for a long time, and they know they need to do it because it has other co-benefits. But due to the nature of their business being quite cash strapped, it's just been really low on the priority, and also just that access to that capital has been challenging. So using other sources of revenue, if you don't have that cost saving necessarily from your project, using that ACCUs revenue to pay off a portion of that capital is an option that we're seeing more and more recently.
All right, great. Well, I notice people are dropping off as well, and that's fine. It's been a very insightful, and probably people now have to digest all that information that we presented on the different schemes and elements of a energy target. Sorry, maybe there's another question. Sorry. missed the other question. So did the case study one end up installing a cogeneration plant, and how would that help with emissions reduction given the additional gas consumption? Chris?
Yep. Really good question. So they haven't done it yet, and they might not. In many ways, cogeneration, they might have missed the window for cogeneration. It probably would have been a good idea 5 years ago for them, or 10 years ago. But now, if they install a cogen plant, it is going to increase their gas consumption, which will increase their Scope 1 emissions, and that's much harder to offset. I mean, they still may do it. It still might be. It still probably, in the long run, would save them money, as opposed, because what the alternative for them to do is to not do the cogen, and instead offset their electricity use by purchasing renewable energy, and that's probably what they will end up doing. But at the moment, renewable electricity still costs at a premium, whether you buy green power or do a PPA or whatever. So if you look at cogen, it still has a payback compared to that. So they're still considering it, but no, they haven't done it yet. And I think they will probably end up purchasing renewable electricity. And a follow-up question on hydrogen. What are our thoughts on hydrogen, and do we see it as feasible? Look, I think hydrogen is definitely going to have a role to play, but it's potentially, somewhat overstated perhaps in a lot of cases. It'll definitely have a role in those high temperature process heating areas like steel smelting and things like that, where you can't get there with electrification. And so it's definitely going to have a role, and a lot of companies are looking at it. I think our frustration, though, is when companies include hydrogen as part of their strategy, because it's not here yet. And it may not be here for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I mean, there's a lot of people working really hard to bring that forward, so it may well be commercially and technically viable sooner. But what if it's not? Where does that leave your strategy? So I think my thoughts are to try and get there without relying on hydrogen and things that aren't cost effective and proven yet. And then if those things do become viable, then you can adjust your plan accordingly. I think it's easier to adjust that way rather than relying on something to work that's yet to be proven and then having to adjust after that.
And just on that, Chris, building on that question or that sentiment, often a heating optimization project has a payback of under 4 years. If you're able to finance that optimization or that upgrade and save money up until that hydrogen, technology is available, that's certainly an option as well, and it shouldn't be discarded. Because yes, if hydrogen is if a commercially viable hydrogen technology is available in 10 years, if it's a 4-year payback and you're able to implement soon, then that leaves you 5 years of savings, cost savings, until you can invest in that equipment, and it can still help you hit those emissions reductions as soon as possible rather than leaving it until later.
Sorry, just taking a moment there to come off mute. It looks like we're probably reached the end of the questions, and had some really useful discussion there on different items around the topics of different fuels and emissions reduction associated with them. So we'll wrap it up there. And I guess if you do have any further questions, just note that we will be sending out the recording of the webinar to participants, and you can use that as an opportunity to follow up with any questions. And also, look us up on LinkedIn and reach out directly. And if you need any help in developing your carbon inventory or identifying any opportunities for reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, and also carbon offsetting, accessing different certificates, then please get in touch. But yeah, thanks to Chris and Claire for the excellent presentations, and we'll leave it there.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.